Welcome those of you who joined the chat. I'll begin here in about a minute. Let some other folk hop in. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Theodore Foster. I'm an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. This is the second of 6 Black Studies speakers who are contributing to our Black Study Within and Beyond Crisis working group that makes space for UL students, faculty, and staff to more critically engage the work of Black study in the field of Black studies. To begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the UL College of Liberal Arts, UL Department, English Department, and UL Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy, as well as the Gilboa Charitable Trust. I also want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Maria Steger and Dr. Ian Biemish, for their work coordinating and supporting this opportunity. I will now read a brief land acknowledgement drafted by my colleague, Dr. Marissa Petro, in First Nation groups in the Louisiana area. Dr. Petro is the director of the Gilboa Center for Public History. UL Lafayette is on the land of the Atakapa Ishak, and we honor the Atakapa Ishak in a land with gratitude. We would also like to express our gratitude to elders, past, present, and future, of the dozens of other First Nations in the Louisiana area, including the Chitimacha, Appaloosa, Alagraa, Tunica Biloxi, Jena Choctaw, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, and Coushatta. We also honor the peoples of African descent who were enslaved on this land when it was part of the Mouton family's sugar plantation. The center's full land acknowledgement can be found at www.gilboacenter.com/honor-native-land. Now, a bit more about the purpose of this speaker series. Black studies emerged within the university as a product of an institutional crisis with the ongoing condition of unfreedom for Black students, community, and life in 1969. As an interdisciplinary field of study, it has been subject to much evolution over the past half century. New ruptures in the field require a revaluation of the role of the university, the academic, and the socio-political terrain that Black studies must navigate. Against the backdrop of the pandemic, the uprisings of summer 2020, and renewed institutional calls for anti-racist reforms, what is the function of critical knowledge production toward the liberation of Black people? How can Black studies meaningfully meet the imperatives of education and communities under crisis? Why is it important to think of Black studies, life, and culture beyond crisis? The Critical Speaker Series and Working Group in Black Studies takes a broad interdisciplinary approach to the work of the humanities under multiple crises. Scholars and artists will introduce the UL community to recent scholarship in the field through their writings and virtual engagement. I think I've got a chat about video, so let me make sure. Bedour, you can see me, yes? And someone throw in the Q&A if you can't see my video. Cool. The purpose of this space is not to contribute to the spectacular and profitable representation of Black life as crisis, but to understand how critical tools of analysis distinct to Black study and Black critical thought can create new avenues to rupture the enduring relation of slavery's afterlife to the modern world. This Friday, poet, educator, and cultural organizer Ashley Jones will be giving a virtual talk titled The Poetics of Black Women, a Genealogy for Black Study. On April 7th, Dr. Sharice Bergen-Stelly will be giving a talk titled Black Studies, Black Struggle, and Black Liberation. On April 14th, LaTanya Autry will be giving a talk with a forthcoming title on museums, Black Studies, and curation. And on April 21st, Dr. Ronaldo Walcott will be giving a talk titled On Reparations, Ontological Incoherence, and Living in a Catastrophe. Today, we are gathered virtually to welcome Dr. Bedour Alagraa for her talk titled Sunlight Through the Fog, Caribbean Thought, and the Promise of Black Studies. Bedour Alagraa is an assistant professor of political and social thought in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She received her PhD from the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University in the spring of 2019, and was an Andrew W. Mellon Graduate Fellow during her time at Brown. She also holds a BA in political science from the University of Toronto and a master's in race, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies from the London School of Economics. Her book manuscript is titled The Interminable Catastrophe, Fatal Liberalisms, Plantation Logics, and Black Political Life in the Wake of Disaster, and charts a conceptual history of catastrophe as a political category and concept rather than event, via its inauguration in early modern natural science and empiricist debates, and subsequent crystallization as a concept on the plantation. More broadly, she is interested in Black political thought, especially Caribbean political thought, African anti-colonial thought, and Black Marxisms. Bedour has been published in several journals, including Critical Ethnic Studies, Contemporary Political Theory, the C.L.R. James Journal of Caribbean Philosophy, Small Acts, and Souls. Bedour is also co-editor alongside Anthony Bogues of the Black Critique book series at Pluto Press, and is a member of the editorial team currently working on Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis, which is forthcoming. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Bedour, who'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A afterwards.
Hi, thanks, Theo. Can everyone hear me? I think yes, I hope yes. Okay, great. Let me just get myself sorted here. So, hi, everyone, and thank you all for taking some time to listen to me today as I kind of wander and meander through some thoughts on Caribbean thought and Black studies. Before I begin, I want to thank ULL for having me and to everyone who helped organize this really incredible series of lectures. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was really trying my best to grapple with the significance and importance of Caribbean thought and Black studies, both in an institutional sense and in the broader context of study and struggle. Because of my own background intellectually, my Black studies orientation has always been one and the same as being steeped in Caribbean thought. But the purpose of this talk is to consider what are the illuminating and sometimes contradictory presences of Caribbean thought in Black studies today. In other words, in what ways does Caribbean thought on the one hand stretch the constitutive limits of Black studies while at the same time refusing the same limits and exceeding it? How do we use Caribbean thought to reach for the fluvia that sits outside of Black studies in an official sense, but holds its place as the concealed nucleus of Black study, as it were? I hope that I can create a roadmap via some thinkers, Derek Walcott, Sylvia Wynter, Kamel Brathwaite, Edward Glissant, a roadmap for considering how that thing I'm reaching for is already enfolded in everything I do as a Black studies scholar. So what I have to do now is to think and theorize from the inside out. So what I'm going to do is kind of break with my own form a little bit. I've always been a bit of a systems thinker. Anybody who knows me knows this, but I'm not going to do that today. Instead, like I said, I'm going to wander a little bit. I'm going to think about those lessons that I've learned from Caribbean thinkers, which have formed the bedrock of my outlook on the world, and certainly formed the foundation of my thinking as it pertains to Black studies and Black study more broadly. If this presentation seems discontinuous, jumpy, or puzzly, then I've done my job. Now, this brings me to the title of this talk, and some of you might know this and others might not, but this quote is from Derek Walcott's essay, Antilles, Fragments of Epic History, in which he's describing some of the conundrums that he faces as a Caribbean writer. And he writes the following, quote, "All of the Antilles, every island is an effort of memory, every mind, every racial biography culminating in amnesia and fog, pieces of sunlight through the fog, and sudden rainbows, arc-en-ciel. That is the effort, the labor of the Antillean imagination, rebuilding its gods from bamboo frames, phrase by phrase," end quote. I want to suggest that this is what it means to engage with Caribbean thought. It is to glimpse at the sunlight peeking through the fog, that despite the heaviness and the occlusion that from time to time, a brilliant arc-en-ciel makes its way through the density. This process then of rebuilding gods from bamboo frames, right, phrase by phrase, this is, I think, directly related to Derek Walcott's invocations of Adamic naming, which is one paradigmatic frame or utterance that, since I encountered it, has defined my relationship to Black studies and pushed me further into Black study. Now, this project of Adamic naming is best understood in his collection of essays, the same collection of essays where you can find that first essay that I quoted from, What the Twilight Says is the name of the volume. Now, the three opening essays What the Twilight Says, The Muse of History, and Antilles, Fragments of Epic Memory, set the stage for his writing on kind of archipelagic life. These three essays should be read as a triptych, right? They're all, I think, engaged equally in an Adamic project, right? In the first essay, What the Twilight Says, he writes, quote, "Then the twilight being his way of describing the Antillean predicament, most resembled dawn. Then how simple it all seemed. We could walk like new atoms. Then even the old rules were exciting," end quote. He then escalates, writing, quote, "What would deliver him from servitude was the forwarding of a language that went beyond mimicry, a dialect which had the force of revelation as it invented names for things, one which finally settled on its own mode of inflection, and which began to create an oral culture of chants, jokes, folk songs, and fables. This, not merely the debt of history, was his proper claim to the new world. For him, metaphor was not a symbol, but a conversation. And because every poet begins with such ignorance, in the anguish that every noun will be freshly, resonantly named, because a new melodic inflection meant a new mode, there was no better beginning," end quote. This is the second installation in his triptych, The Muse of History, which I considered in my essay, Homo Narrans. Now, looking back, I did not properly consider that this was the second panel in a triptych, right? That was a mistake on my part because it ignores the bedrock that he laid in the first essay, What the Twilight Says. Now, in this second essay, The Muse of History, he opens with another phrase that has been defining of my relationship to Black study and to writing more generally. And he writes the following, quote, "Those who break a tradition first hold it in awe," end quote. Before falling for Walcott's words, the closest thing to this kind of phraseology that I encountered as a young student in political theory was when Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism that the highest form of possession is destruction, namely that you know you have something precisely in the moment that you were prepared to discard it. I like Walcott's charge better because breaking with tradition is also a way of extending it in a way. Now, to return to my piece, Homo Narrans, I wrote that the Caribbean radical imagination is a project of Adamic naming. Now, I don't think I pushed myself hard enough with this claim. I was a first-year graduate student when I wrote it, deep in the awe, but not yet having made the break. And I want to suggest that Black studies rightfully holds in awe, and Black study is to enact the break. Both necessary, but one holds us and the other releases us, offers us the great leap, as Fanon called it. One naturally exceeds the other. In other words, for me, Black study means holding the tradition, not to build new cathedrals, but for the purpose of eventually tugging at the threads until it breaks. Now, Walcott continues, quote, "The great poets of the New World, from Whitman to Neruda, their vision of man in the New World is Adamic. In their exuberance, he is still capable of enormous wonder," end quote. Right? This sense of wonder, of always looking at things as though they are new. This is what the charge of Adamic naming offers us. When Sylvia Wynter asks, "But what does wonder do?" This is what comes to mind. This is what thinking in and through the Caribbean gives us. When the Twilight speaks, it's with a sense of wonder that I look to carry with me as I engage in Black study and indeed, wherever I go. I'll end this section on Adamic gestures with another Derek Walcott quote. Now, in his poem from Metamorphosis Moon, he writes the following, quote, "Refusing poetry, I am becoming a poem," end quote. What are the ways that we can refuse the structure and become the thing that the structure can't hold? By refusing Black studies in certain ways, namely via certain modes of institutionalization, we get closer and closer to Black study, as it were. Caribbean thought is the way that I do this, refusing poetry and becoming the poem, that is. Now, we can't think of sunlight against the fog, of refusing poetry and becoming the poem, of refusing the institution and becoming the idea, of Caribbean thought and Black study without looking at the work and life of Sylvia Wynter. In her piece on how we mistook the map for the territory, she writes that there was a brief moment in the 1960s when the transformation into a new studio might have been completed within the context of global Black power, of the global Black power movement with its three arms: Black arts, Black aesthetics, and Black studies, and the anti-colonial struggles of the Third World. These movements offered the, quote, initially penetrating insights, end quote, that called into question the structures of the global world system and the nature of the, quote, absently present framework which mandated all their and our respective subjections, end quote. Within this brief hiatus, the disciplinary apparatus and its boundaries would challenge a range of anti-colonial and other intellectual movements, particularly by, again, Black studies, Black arts, and Black aesthetics movements, before these movements were, quote unquote, re-co-opted. As Winter shows, these insights presented or represented their ultimate failure, quote, in the wake of their politically activist phase to complete intellectually that emancipation, end quote. Winter argues that the reason for this failure is that the psychic emancipation initiated by these movements for that brief hiatus, quote, had been effected at the level of the map rather than at the level of the territory, end quote. The academic system gifted to the natives was merely a Trojan horse. Black studies, in that brief hiatus she described, succumbed to the seduction of genre thinking and of the territory, being that of instituting our present ethnoclass or Western bourgeois genre of the human, enacted in part by the presence of disciplines. Settling into institutions and turning away from the heretical statements that gave rise to Black studies signal the death knell of this brief hiatus, this moment in the sun. We can also think about the move away from this already compromised Black studies towards this new genre of anti-racist consulting dressed in the garments of Black studies as part of this original era of mistaking the map for the territory. Winter has given us the language to call these things what they are. I recently interviewed Sylvia Winter in a conversation titled, "What Will Be the Cure?" where she states that on her return to Jamaica in the 1960s, quote, "We had to take our work of transforming the society elsewhere into a different arena totally. And that is where you have the Jamaica Journal beginning. It was a way to retell the past and the present at the same time. You see, it had belonged to the former masters, and we, being former slaves, took it over totally. We were able to forego that cheap and easy radicalism of simply organizing the state differently, and we began to tell different origin stories of who we are as Black people and as Africans," end quote. I then asked her specifically about her experiences during the early formation of Black studies in the United States, to which she responded, quote, "It's that simple. We were starting from a negation on the part of the institution, but I had come with all the knowledge and language I had developed on the creative side of the Jamaica Journal. I did not enter these conversations concerning Black studies with the institution in mind, but rather with the Jamaica Journal's practice of enacting an autonomous space for transformation. And I had always viewed Black studies as a way of trying to enact a transformation of knowledge, and we did go pretty far at it. But this is, of course, not how the institution saw it. Black studies was a way of figuring out how to enact a kind of knowledge transformation. I was carrying out, again, the work of the Jamaica Journal, but not the institution you see. And this is where the potential of Black studies was," end quote. For Winter, carrying out the work of Black studies was, again, one and the same as the work of the Jamaica Journal, reclaiming our past selves as slaves, as masters, building new gods out of the old ones, out of bamboo frames, phrase by phrase. And finally, she remarks, quote, "This is what is important now to remember about Black studies during those early years, that it was one part of a bigger project of developing this transformation of knowledge, and therefore the transformation of the whole society by using a different language to address the intellectual concerns," end quote. In her critique of Black studies and how we mistook the map for the territory, she doesn't offer what she offers here. She tells us we got pretty far. I'm personally a fan of what Du Bois calls splendid failures. This is how I choose to understand the life course of Black studies. We can also think about her interview in Proud Flesh, where she says that the next great battle of Black studies will be waged against the truth as it has been dictated to us by Western episteme's descriptive code of the human, and how this indictment of the truth has been a consistent feature of her in her works, right? Take, for example, her NHI, No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues, right? This is, as the title suggests, not simply an expression or an understanding of what this acronym means for our descriptive code of the human, but it's an admonition of her academic colleagues, right? In which she writes the following, quote, "The starving fella, or the jobless inner city NHI, the global new poor, or les damnés," Fanon pointed out, does not have to inquire into the truth. They are the truth. It is we who institute this truth. We must now undo their narratively condemned status," end quote. She rightfully looks to her colleagues for their complicity in the narrative condemnation of the global damnée, and even further, she writes the following, quote, "In a 1984 essay, I had proposed that the task of Black studies, together with those of all the other new studies that had also entered academia in the wake of the 1960s uprisings, should be that of rewriting knowledge. My proposal did not get very far then. After Los Angeles, however, both the times and the situation have changed. Hence my open letter to you. St. Clair Drake, one of the founders of Afro-American Studies program at Stanford, always pointed out to students that there were, quote, street tasks and intellectual tasks. To extrapolate from Drake, there is street speech and intellectual speech. It is not unfair to say that the recent Los Angeles example of the street tasks and the street speech of a captive population imposing its will upon the city and the state by the only means it has available to place in the absence of that new post-industrial and post-nation state speech or order of knowledge." And I'm thinking about this in the wake of, 2020 and all the letters that were circulated afterwards. She made it abundantly clear. Black studies formalized, and the absence of that new order of knowledge could not take the place of what people must and will do to impose their will. At the beginning of this talk, I said that Caribbean thought is how I managed to think from the inside out. There's no better example of thinking from the inside out than Winter's refusal to let Black studies off the hook and demand instead Black study. Her critiques of Black studies, while also recognizing the immense possibilities of Black studies at the same time, is directly linked in my estimation to her ideas concerning the third event. Now, this is one thing that I think I did do properly in my piece that I referred to earlier. So I'll pull from it directly and then loop back. And so Winter explains, for those of you who are not familiar, that there's a third unresolved event akin to the Copernican and Darwinian ruptures, which is the kind of realm of possibility for a way out of our overdetermined descriptive code of the human, being man one and man two. And this third unresolved event is the Fanonian, which she locates in his description or in his sociogenic statement, in which he writes, right, quote, "It will be seen that the Black man's alienation is not an individual question. Beside phylogeny and ontogeny stands sociogeny, a statement after which, according to Winter, quote, every discipline you are practicing ceases to exist," end quote. Right? The sociogenic principle offers a disciplinary breach, which is a primary concern for Winter's thought, right? Because of its insistence that matter of culture bear a great deal on the bios, making us, in the words of Winter, hybridly human rather than biologically overdetermined. Right? And finally, sociogeny renders possible Fanon's insistence on bringing invention into existence, precisely because of this principle's shattering of the idea that human life and human sociology is entirely biologically determined or outside our control. By intervening via Fanon's sociogenic principle, we can now take the matter of reconstituting our lives into our own hands. Fanon's final call to, quote, set afoot a new man is the basis for her proclamation in Unsettling the Coloniality of Being that, quote, all our present struggles are different facets of the central ethnoclass man versus human struggle, end quote. In this way, the third event is not bound up in the anticipatory or the delay, but rather it shows that what she calls the mutations from the first to second and eventually third events are brought about by heretical statements, by refusals and rewritings of the governing texts. So then the struggle is certainly over which heretical statements will unburden us of those scripts which deny us our reality, which is that we are both flesh and story at the same time. That is where the struggle is. And I'm convinced as she is that only language can get us there. So then where are these heretical statements? For Winter, it's in the Joan Canoe, it's in the poets like Césaire, it's in the blues as she describes in Black Metamorphosis, right? Black studies is an important foundation, but Black study is what we reach for and activate in order to reach those heretic statements and give us that terrifying and necessary break. In my own work, I try to think about how I might also engage in a kind of Adamic naming project as it concerns catastrophe. We all use the word, but why can't I do what I want with it? Why can't I hold it in awe and then break with it? Why can't I lace the idea of catastrophe with a sense of wonder? The answer to these questions is that I can. Part of what I'm trying to consider is how catastrophe is tied to the narrative condemnation of our whole planet. And part of what I'm attempting is to try and undo that narrative condemnation as Winter instructs us, right? This is where I find Kamau Brathwaite the most useful. not only for my own project, but as another pillar in my thinking concerning Black study. Because to hold in awe and then to break is one thing, but how to actually go about that break? Brathwaite tells us that one thing we have always done in the Americas is to break with the pentameter. And he writes the following in the History of the Voice, quote, "Over in the New World, the Americans tried to bridge or break the pentameter through a cosmic movement, a large movement of sound. The hurricane does not roar in pentameters. And that's the problem. How do you get a rhythm which approximates the natural experience, the environmental experience," end quote. Perhaps breaking with the pentameter, breaking with that which we hold in awe, requires what Glissant calls la pensée du tremblement, a quakeful or tremulous thinking. Right? And in doing this, Glissant calls me to task personally. He says that archipelagic thought is opposed to systems thinking. I'm now made to account for myself and to think again and again from the inside out. Myth and poetry, the keys to relation, are found in the quakeful. He offers in one explanation, right, of la pensée du tremblement, or tremulous thought, he offers in one explanation a passage from Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land as an explanation of it. And he quotes this part, the following, quote, "Those who invented neither gunpowder nor compass, those who could harness neither steam nor electricity, for those who never conquered anything but yield, captivated to the essence of things, ignorant of services but captivated by the motion of all things, indifferent to conquering but playing the game of the world." Glissant then paraphrases, quote, "those who tremble when the world is shaking," end quote. Tremulous thinking never allows us the relief of a landing place. It forces us, as he says, to tremble when the world is shaking, a kind of thinking that's anxious, fretful, disquieted. When Dion Brand says, "I don't want no fucking country, here or there and all the way back," that is tremulous thinking. When Suzanne Césaire declared, quote, "and now a return to ourselves," end quote, that is also tremulous thinking. In 2003, Glissant wrote the following, quote, "Look around, the earth trembles everywhere. Volcanoes disembowel, floods level countries, tornadoes uproot villages, epidemics unstoppable, temperatures inflame, water runs out and pollutes, famines ruin communities without appeal, and all this most commonly the consequence of the work of man. Resist the thought of the apocalypse," end quote. Turning away from the thought of the apocalypse, I embrace catastrophic thought and offer my thanks to Glissant for giving me another piece in my scaffolding of Black study. Now, what do I mean by catastrophic thought? This is something I've said before, but I'll say it again, right? I argue that catastrophe is defined by an interminability or a repetition akin to a bad infinity. The interminable sets itself over and against the terminal, embedding the endpoint inside each point in the series, while also leading to the piling up of time over and over, right? I also noted that catastrophe is defined by a stubborn contradiction, right, of its assumption as a harbinger of the end, while also failing to ever bring about that end. This contradiction, right, in which the end is embedded in and defines the interminable, is again the contradiction that I'm not trying to escape, but I'm trying to inhabit. And so for me, catastrophic thought is the type of thinking that sets itself over and against itself. It displaces itself, then places itself at the middle, and continues doing that again and again until an interruption occurs. And so because of this kind of catastrophic thinking that I'm trying to do, I'm able to recognize its presence as the connective tissue of everyday plantocratic life, which also propels Black people in these spaces to think differently and to do differently, right? It's an acknowledgement of catastrophe's incomplete nature, and its incompleteness is what permits these possibilities to emerge and to take hold. More importantly, under the thumb of the catastrophic, the key political consideration for me is a social one concerned with the predicament of how we might all live together on this planet in the face of terrible loss. I've only been able to do this because of what Caribbean thought has given me. My own work is an attempt at a mosaic of Adamic thinking, of the twilight, of heretic statements, of tremulous thinking, of breaking the meter, of catastrophic thought. And so I'll end by giving thanks to Black Studies for setting me on the path to Black study, with all its frustrations and contradictions and limitations, right? I'll end with the thanks that's offered by Derek Walcott to the New World itself, where he writes, quote, "I accept this archipelago of the Americas. I give the strange and bitter yet ennobling thanks for the monumental groaning and soldiering of two great worlds, like the halves of a fruit seamed by its own bitter juice, that exiled from your own Edens, you've placed me in the wonder of another, and that was my inheritance and your gift," end quote. Yes, a strange thanks indeed to this aporia that we can call Black Studies. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for that really beautiful genealogy of Caribbean thought, Black studies, and Black study. I'll let folk take a minute to breathe and think about some questions that I invite you all to share via the Q&A. So please populate questions there. I'll ask them, and Bedour will take her time responding. I have one to start, however. A lot of my experience with Black studies, begins in a small place called Birmingham, Alabama, and all of the greats that I know you know, Bedour, who stem from this place. In particular, Angela Davis, right, who is a certain genealogy of Black radical thought and thinking. And she made a comment at an event in Birmingham in 2019 when she was being celebrated by activists after being denied a human rights award honoring civil rights veteran Fred Shuttlesworth through the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And she was making a kind of response or comment to someone who was, celebrating her and saying, we're standing on your shoulders. And she said, we should think about that statement, because if you're standing on someone's shoulders, it means, first of all, you've learned pretty much all that they've learned. You know what they know, but you're on their shoulders and can see a great deal further, right? Which isn't quite, the same argument you're making, I think, in terms of, tradition and break. But that's the first thought that came to mind. What kind of traditions do we project and learn from a figure like Angela Davis, and what kind of break are folk involved in this moment? Folk in the streets and folk in the tower, as it were. So, what break was Caribbean thought for you, and when? I'm thinking like you gave us this, beginning and ending with Derek Walcott. How does Caribbean thought, or how as a method of thinking, right, of catastrophe in this brilliant way, what has Caribbean thought been to your development of that kind of method over time, right? I first read Jamaica Kincaid, an undergrad in a small place, still wrecks me, right? Thinking about Black studies and my relationship to a small place like Birmingham. But I never thought of her as a political thinker, but I must, after, this talk in so many ways.
Okay, I'm gonna do my best to address all the parts of your question. Also, another fave from Birmingham, Sonny Sanchez, she's from Birmingham as well, I believe. Yes, so Birmingham does produce a lot of, for a small place, right? Produces a lot of heavy hitters. So how does Caribbean thought allow me to kind of make the break? So I don't know if I've made the break yet, personally. Right? I think it would be a lot to assume that at the point that I'm at, and that given what I've read and understood, that I'm prepared to take that leap. But what I do know, right, is that Caribbean thought has given me a different language, a different lexicon, right, through which I can start to think about the whole entire world, right? And for me, this lexicon of, the twilight, of the Adamic, of tremulous thought, all of these things, right? They're not just useful for thinking about the Caribbean. This is how these are movable paradigms to me. To me, you can take these, you can put them anywhere, and obviously they're not going to be perfect. They're not going to do all the work we want them to do, but it gives us an opening, right? And so maybe the break that I'm looking for is less a break and more of a kind of aperture or an opening onto something else through which I can kind of pass through. And I think that there's also, I mean, this might be kind of controversial to say, but for me, I mean, if you look at what Sylvia Wynter says, you'll see that even Black studies in an institutional sense has always been Caribbean, right? Even from the very beginning, because you had people like her who completely disregarded the institution and just did what they were doing as people, carrying with them everything that they had. And so for me, right, in order to do Black studies properly, you have to have that language that these people who were there from the very beginning were using, and that it means necessarily engaging with the Caribbean. Now, Caribbean thought, right, for me, and if I'm thinking about Derek Walcott and saying that this kind of archipelagic thought, like this kind of island-based thought is defined by the twilight, right? So for him, the twilight is this like position of almost being trapped, but being trapped in that way allows him to see the world in a way that's really particular, right? And so the break is, sometimes we think about a break as kind of like teleological, right? Like we have to kind of make that leap into the break. And I think Fanon does this a little bit. But for him, right, staying right where he is the break. That's what allows him to break with tradition after having held it in awe. And so he talked about how he's read Whitman and Neruda, all the greats, but staying right where he is what allows him to kind of make or enact the break. And the break for him is giving the strange thanks, right? That's for him is the break, because he's no longer compelled to explain either recrimination or despair, as he called it. He no longer feels compelled or conscripted into that text, right? He is going to operate on a different register, a different transcript, right? In that space, in the twilight. And for me, right, I feel as though the way that I have deliberately just refused certain conversations, that's something I get, right, from thinking through the twilight. I do not have to be conscripted into certain conversations. And if I feel stuck in a way, maybe that's where the break is, right? And that's certainly something that I get from Derek Walcott specifically. I hope that answered your question a little bit.
No, it's beautiful. It's back to Walcott, which I think is important for your citation practice too. Thank you for that clarification. David Squires has a question that I'll read and share. Thanks for such a great talk. It felt optimistic about the role of Black studies has to play in academia and the world beyond, an intellectual and street speech, as you put it. I also appreciate how you revisit your earlier work to demonstrate a mode of self-critique that might transform your own and our thinking. Is self-critique a mode of transformation for changing the world beyond academia? I wonder because the severity of anti-Black racism seems to require constant and merciless critique. How does the work to critique state and institutional violence work along with or benefit from self-critique?
Okay. Another really important question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it. In terms of the way that I critique myself, I mean, I'm committed to like a world of ideas, and if I don't critique myself, my thinking won't be rigorous, and I won't do justice to the people that I'm reading and I'm engaging with, who were themselves deeply reflexive and constantly, and the people that I am engaging with, Derek Walcott, Sylvia Wynter, etc., they did not see themselves as academics first and foremost. They were writers, right? The first thing that they were before anything else is they were writers. And what is a writer if not revision, right? I mean, that's what makes a writer is a process of revision. And that's something that writers do that I think, at least in my experience as an academic, revision isn't as important as it should be. And I think unless I make it a point, right, to put it in my talk that I'm going to go back to this piece, right, and revise, that there wouldn't be any other kind of encouragement or impetus for me to do so, right? It's more so a choice rather than a requirement, which is not what the case is for someone who has a kind of writerly outlook as opposed to a kind of technical academic outlook. And so these are people who are writers and were committed to revision. And so I try my best, right, to hold that as well. And in terms of like merciless critique, so I'm a fan of critique. And I know that there are many who feel like critique has become kind of reductive and hasn't really been contributing. I think the thing that actually kills thinking is the push for novelty, right? Good critique does more than that, right? The push for novelty is what really kills thinking. Good critique is really, really difficult to do. And when it's done properly, right, it actually pushes us into that thing that we might think is novel or new, right? And good critique can really do that. Now, the question is are the critiques we're offering any good? That is a different question, right? Because the critiques have to, on the one hand, engage, at least in a basic way, good faith of an argument or what have you, right? But these thinkers that I've cited, right, critique is there, but it's not the bedrock, right? The critique is there because it needs to be and it performs a certain function, but it's not the bedrock of every single thing that they do, right? Sometimes when I hear people talk about Sylvia Wynter's work, they say that primarily what she's doing is she's offering a critique of the human or a critique of Western episteme. And to me, that's not what she's doing, right? She is theorizing kind of Black life on its own terms mostly, right? The critique is there, and because the critique is so well done, it becomes overdetermined, right, in the kind of landscape of the work. So that's how I kind of see it. Like critique, and good critique is necessary, right? It's part of the fabric of any good, well thought out idea, right? But it is one of many moving parts. And if those other moving parts are not there, then the critique risks kind of, again, overdetermining itself and not serving the function that it needed to in the first place. So yeah.
That's really helpful. That's really, really helpful. Thank you for that exchange. We have another question from a student of mine, Xavier D'Artes, who comments, as someone who casually reads Black studies, especially those from the Caribbean, I find their ability to subvert the knowledge and philosophical underpinnings with people such as Orlando Patterson and Charles Mills, who've been great at writing and understanding the language of Westernization. And he clarified with me that his question is, why are Caribbean writers so good at subverting? Which certainly is not, quote unquote, natural outgrowth. But I think it does beg the question about space, history, writing, thinking that this point of the archipelago is really central to. So, but to echo Xavier's question, why are Caribbean writers so good at subverting?
Well, I'll start by saying that I don't want to kind of burden the Caribbean with the task of doing all the kind of intellectual maneuvers that maybe the rest of us haven't gotten to yet. I don't want to unfairly place that burden on the Caribbean to always be kind of magical, and that's certainly not what I'm trying to do. I think every part of the world has its contributions. Now, for me, the reason why the Caribbean has been so effective, right, which is different from why the Caribbean is better than everything else, right? So for me, why the Caribbean has been such an effective way to think through it is, number one, right, the kind of historical antecedents of being the site of the Columbian encounter of 1492, right? Without the Caribbean, we don't have the New World view, as it were. But there is something about, and this is something that Glissant does so well, right? There's something, and Walcott, of course, right? There's something about the physical geography of the Caribbean, right? These small places where on the one hand, you feel condemned or trapped to this twilight predicament, but then at the same time, the whole world is open to you, right? You're kind of opening onto the whole world. There's like an expanse and a kind of, like Walcott says, right, this understanding of being trapped at the same time, right? And that this feeling of moving hither and thither, what Du Bois calls, right? This feeling of moving hither and thither inside these small places produces a kind of thinking. Now, because these are small places, when bad things happen, the reverberations are really intense, right? And that produces a kind of writing, aesthetic mediations that are particular to those places, right? So for example, in a place as small as Barbados or St. Lucia, right? When a hurricane happens, the reverberations are so immense and so intense, right? That it, again, out of that comes attempts to grapple with it in ways that are distinct to that geography, right? And so it says much to do with the kind of linguistic variations of French, English, Spanish, all whatever, right? It has as much to do with that as it does to do with the physical geography and the landscape of those places. And of course, right, the historical confluence of Spanish, French, British Empire, all kind of making their landing place in these very small places, right? So what happens when empire lands all at once, right? Or it feels like all at once in these small places, right? What happens when you feel, right, like you're in a kind of twilight existence, right? That you see the light, you see the expanse, but then you feel trapped at the same time, as Derek Walcott calls it. What happens when you're in a really small place and bad things happen, right? That produces, again, an aesthetic mediation that is distinct and that gives us an outlook onto the world that no other place does. So that's what I get from getting that.
No, that's really rich and a good turn of perspective on the Caribbean as a small place. Michael Cordova asks, with relation to the proposition of reverence, critique, and expansion, rather than just idolization of Black scholars, activists, and writers, what guidance might you provide to students and radicals alike who play into the politics of idolization rather than paying reverence to Black figures? And what ways, in the eyes of Caribbean thought, can we as students and thinkers alike break from this engagement with idolization of Black radicals that leaves us static, as Winter has explored?
Ooh, that's a hard one. That's a really difficult one because, you know, all people have their saints. And I'm not going to deny anybody that desire. I don't think it's always a bad thing to have your saints, as it were. Now, what do these saints do is a different question, right? Because, you know, saints appear and move differently depending on, you know, the culture that you're in. What a saint does in Louisiana is different from what a saint does, right, in Rome, the way that they interact with people and move through the world, right? So I won't deny anybody the right to their saints, but the question is, what do these saints do for us? And it's difficult because I am guilty of this sometimes, right? I also have my saints that I pull from and that I find immensely important, who I can't really see myself as a thinker outside of their presence, right? And so then how do we acknowledge the immense impact that these thinkers have on us while also not monumentalizing them, right? And then, you know, dehumanizing them as a result? I think it's like walking a tightrope. At some point, you're going to fall on one side or the other, but you might get back on the tightrope, walk for a little bit, and you might fall and come. I think it's a constant struggle. I've never settled on any particular way to get it right, right? But what I can do is go back to my ideas and constantly revise them, right? And think about, how am I using these thinkers? Am I instrumentalizing them? Are they human beings, right? In the way that I'm discussing them and thinking through them, right? Am I giving myself space to speak, right? Because in a way, when we monumentalize certain thinkers, right, we reduce our own voice. We say that our voice is less important and should take less space, right? As a process of this reverence. So is my voice there? Do I matter, right? I think that's equally a part of kind of de-godding these thinkers. And in the process of de-godding them, right, we don't want to lose the affection and the care that we have towards them, right? We simply want to be able to talk to them, to really talk to them and have a conversation with them. And you can't do that with a statue or a monument, right? But you can do that with saints. You can talk to them, right? So I haven't settled on an actual answer, but this is how I've sort of been working through the contradiction, the antagonism, as it were.
Another really helpful generative response. Angela Davis is one of those idols that I have to continuously draw from, but is, I think, the subject of a lot of, critique that doesn't really get at the kind of language of desire and experience that you're speaking to here.
And sometimes, right, the push to monumentalize is actually a push to consume that person, right, entirely, to ingest them whole and to just be so imbricated with them that we're actually trying to consume them in a really kind of like cannibalistic way. And that's certainly not, we feed the saints, we don't eat them and consume them, so to speak, metaphorically or non-metaphorically, right? So, yeah.
Consumption can be a mess, and we definitely, there's a fractured relationship with racial icons like Davis and the imperative to consume and snap a celeb picture. Right?
She's literally still alive. Like many of these thinkers they're still alive. They're here. We could simply talk to them, ask them, engage them on their own terms, right? But there's like this acceleration, right? This kind of, we don't even wait for people to no longer be here before we begin this process of crystallizing them into a monument, right? And then it takes them out of this world in a way that's unfair to them when they're here, So that as well.
Couldn't agree more. Diane Nash and Bob Moses are two elders who contributed so much to a kind of Black radical tradition and thought that I'm thinking with and often about in this way that again it's as if they're not here, but they're very much so present. We are running out of time. I saw one last question that I think is helpful. As a junior scholar in Black Studies, having received an excellent training at Brown and been a part of really excellent conversations across not just that institution, in the chat, Clancy Ratcliffe said, do you teach any of these ideas, heretic statements, tremulous thinking, catastrophic thought, Black Studies, Black Study, Fanon, Brathwaite, or any other material from your talk in undergraduate courses? I know the answer. General education courses, upper division courses, or both. How do you introduce these ideas to students? How do they respond? I will just say that both your writing and your kind of exposition of it is really helpful. It doesn't, I think, diminish the kind of intellectual political power of these thinkers, but guides students through a healthy engagement that, problematizes this will to kind of consume, right? But to engage.
Yeah, so I definitely teach all of these things in my classes. There's not a single class that I will teach, regardless of whether or not it's focused on the Caribbean or not, that will not include all of these thinkers. And for a lot of students, especially undergrads, it'll be their first time encountering these thinkers. And so then you have to think very carefully, this is the point of entry, right? This is the opening onto something that I hope they will kind of continue to explore. So how is that opening going to occur? And you have to be, especially, since this is a series about Black studies, you have to be really, really careful about what it is. And I'm still new to this, right? So in 10 years, I might look back and say, was that the best way to introduce students to the wretched of the earth or discourse on colonialism? Maybe not, right? But I have to sit with where I am in my own intellectual journey and make that call. But then I also have to meet students where they are, right? That's the most difficult part, right? Is meeting students right where they are. And these students come from like so many different backgrounds, right? So it's always a toss-up. And I've taught the same course 3 times, and each time I've started it differently, right? Because, after meeting the students the first time, I realized that I have to begin differently. And also your syllabus should tell a story, right? You should think like, what's the story that I'm trying to tell? Why do these thinkers belong together? What about them is harmonious or contrapuntal, right? Where are they dissonant and where are they kind of harmonized? These are the questions that I think are important for a syllabus, not simply whether or not they're going to get all the kind of heavy hitters in a certain canon, but more so how will they leave this course with something else? And I find it very hard to teach anything by Sylvia Wynter, Kamau Brathwaite, Derek Falk, etc., that doesn't have students leave with something else, even those students who have read these thinkers time and time again, right? Because of the way that each one is a constellation of thinking unto themselves. So complex, so many layers. And so I feel like I'll be teaching these thinkers for the rest of my life and never arriving at the same conclusion with students because of the way that they build their ideas. And I don't remember what was the last part of that question. Oh, how do they respond? I mean, usually they respond well. They don't tell me if they don't respond well. They keep it to themselves. But for many of the students, right, they think to themselves, why haven't I read Kamau Brathwaite in all my classes? You know, why haven't I read Derek Walcott in all my classes? How come this is the first time I'm reading Nancy Muller-Hone? Why is this the first time? You know, they ask all kinds of why questions, which is a good thing, right? And that is what I want usually to happen, right? That their kind of understanding of what is necessary in a kind of curricular sense changes. So.
Very, very helpful. In the last 4 minutes, I just wanted to, shout out another student of mine who's attending, who's excellent, who has a quick question you more or less just answered. Raquel says, I feel it is vital to incorporate the tide and history of the Caribbean diaspora and the diaspora in the United States. When we talk about Black history stateside, the general population doesn't include the Caribbean, which I don't think is always the case, but certainly was my experience in Birmingham outside of this one class I took in undergrad. Do you think there is an intentional or unintentional inclusion in the Caribbean diaspora when we discuss historical modern Black studies in the United States?
I think yes and no. I think it depends where you go, right? Because Black studies institutionalized means that every institution will do it differently, right? I went to Brown, which meant that you're going to be reading everything from the Caribbean, and then everything else is kind of orbiting around the kind of Caribbean. You go anywhere else and it might be different. So I think it depends, right? But I think in a general sense, like I said before, right, the Caribbean is there whether we acknowledge it or not, right? So if we're reading Audre Lorde, we're reading Kwame Ture, we're reading Claudia Jones, we're reading June Jordan, we're reading Malcolm X, we're reading Du Bois, like all these people with Caribbean, ancestry and who are Caribbeans, right? I mean, so many of them, Marcus Garvey, etc. George Padmore, all these people who had these kinds of sojourns in the United States or who were American as well, right? Who we don't necessarily think about as Caribbean. And all that's required is not to kind of change the way they related to the Caribbean, but make a kind of titular move where we acknowledge, right, that they are members of a kind of vast Caribbean diaspora and that they're not exceptional because of that. They're deeply ordinary because of the way that diaspora works as far as the Caribbean. And so I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, this kind of refusal to place them as Caribbeans as such. But I think the easiest way to get out of this, right, is to think about the Americas, right? To get away from thinking about the Caribbean and the United States and to instead have a hemispheric paradigmatic frame, thinking about the Americas. And once you make that move, all those, and not all those antagonisms, but a lot of those antagonisms fall away, right? Once you zoom out to the Americas level. And then you get to see, right, all those knots in the threads. You get to see all those linkages. You can see where the links were, where people kind of found one another, where people turned away from one another, right? We can find where the links were made possible and where they were broken, right? Nothing is assumed when you kind of zoom out to the Americas level. And that's kind of how I get out of it. It's not by talking about the United States or the Caribbean, but about the Americas. So.
And not America, which is always a beautiful turn when students make after reading and engaging in class. Yeah. My Black women's history class,
I'll also add that I'm not American, right? I'm not from the United States. So in order for myself to speak, right, in this context, I have to have an America's understanding. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bedour. It's been a beautiful hour learning with you and your work. I hope that folk read Dr. Alagraa's forthcoming manuscript, but also several of the publications that are already out there and some of the public-facing work, Offshoot Mag or offshoot.org.
Yeah.
Offshoot Journal, yes.
You can read the intro to my manuscript there, yeah.
Yes. So thank you. We'll do a round of applause. You can't see everybody, but I know we're clapping and there's a lot of chats dropping and saying thank you.
Thank you.
Don't forget, this Friday we'll have Ashley Jones speaking virtually. You can register at www.liberalarts.louisiana.edu/Black Study, or email me for other interests. So have a good rest of your evening, and thank you so much.
And thanks to all the students who are watching for extra credit. Hope you enjoyed.
Bye.